Last week, in part 1 of the thermal properties of rocks, we learned about the heat capacity and thermal conductivity of different materials, especially rocks. We had a look at the way different materials transfer heat. We looked at the effect it has on rocks with spalling. We placed room temperature rocks outside when it was about 0 degrees Fahrenheit and took a look at how long it took for the rocks to reach an equal temperature with the outdoor air. So especially if you watched part 1, please join us now for part 2 as we have a look at the ancient history of native peoples using rocks for cooking and other purposes, and discover whether a thermal camera needs to be your next tool to go out rockhounding after dusk. I'm Craig the Geologist. Come join me. If you're under the impression that 21st century geologists were the first ones to discover that rocks could store and transfer heat, you're sadly mistaken. This knowledge has been around for millennia, many millennia, tens of thousands of years. I'm at an archaeological site in Oscoda, Michigan, and I use that term very loosely. I want to set your mind at ease here. I'm not disturbing any place that's studied or protected. In fact, I wish this place were studied and protected, but it's not. And to set your mind at ease further, I'm on an ATV trail where really things couldn't get any more disturbed. So when I pick things up, you don't need to worry about it. The next ATV that comes through here will do far worse than me. But what we have around here are soup stones. Indigenous people around the world discovered that it was very hard to make soup without metal cookware. Of course, they didn't know that because they didn't know metal was a thing, really, especially during the Stone Age. And so what they did to cook their soups, their stews, to render fat, to create oils, they would toss stones into a fire, let them get crazy hot, and then toss them into the pot of water, soup, stew, fat, whatever it was you were trying to cook. That way you don't see your precious and very valuable pottery shattered in a fire when you try to cook your soup. You can toss the rocks in. Sometimes they shatter and break, usually they don't, and then you can heat up your soup or stew that way. Let's take a closer look at these. This location, I don't mean the 5 square feet I'm in here, I mean the general area for 100 yards on either side of me. It's thought to have been some sort of an ancient manufacturing site. There is just a massive number of these soup stones around, but there wasn't an actual settlement here. You also find some pottery shards and some debitage from tool making out here, but really what you find are lots and lots of these soup stones. Not every stone is a soup stone. I'll teach you how to identify it in just a moment. But they're all over the place here. Let's have a close look at a soup stone here. The first thing you'll notice about the soup stones is that almost all of them have a red crust on them. That comes from heating in the fire. That repeated heating turns the surface red. You'll notice many of them are also covered with cracks. All the thermal expansion associated with rapid heating and quenching. Throwing it into a fire, throwing it into a pot of cold water, throwing it back into the fire. It shatters these things. Native peoples appear to have tried to find granites, relatively fine-grained granites and quartzites. They probably had a lot of experience, thousands of years of experience picking stones. And while they didn't have geology degrees, they did know what to look for when they were cooking. Get a closer look at these guys here. How about this one? He's huge. Hard hard to say what the original rock was without breaking a fresh surface, and I just don't want to do that. But it would look to me that they used gray wackies, quartzites, and that would be a granite right there. They weren't picky enough to choose one specific rock type by our modern scientific classifications, but they weren't just picking random rocks. They weren't picking limestone. There's a lot of limestone in this area. We don't see any soup stones made of limestone because limestone is probably just an absolutely lousy rock for that. Oh yeah, look at that. See, this was part exposed, but you turn it over and you see that red crust from all the cooking. That is it's hard to say if that's a granite or a quartzite. I'd say it's probably a very quartz-rich granite. These stones are absolutely everywhere out here, and we've just, followed a trail a couple of feet. These soup stones are absolutely everywhere out here. This is probably a piece of debitage from tool making. This would be the crud that they didn't want. But on this limestone here, they were probably working a chert nodule. Native peoples made tools out of chert. Black chert is called flint. That's looking pretty cherty right here. So it looks like they were trying to get to some good tool making material and knock this garbage off of it. Here. That's interesting. This guy here has been driven over several thousand times, but that is one very red soapstone. Just all over here. This is probably the right kind of rock for it. Yep. There's that red we were looking for. Maybe. That one's a little less convincing. That might just be a random rock. Alright, this is your classic soapstone. Look how shattered up and fragmented this piece is. This was definitely a piece of granite here. And this guy, I'm not sure how many times you could heat these rocks before they exploded. I've never experimented with that, and I'm not an archaeologist. I don't know that that's been answered. If it has been answered, I don't know the answer. Over here we see a few examples of both tool making and soapstones. This has been chipped off of something. That's not a random rock shape. That's a chip. That's not a tool itself. It was probably knocked off of a tool. This would be a soapstone right here. If we look around, we start to see a lot of these chips over here. There we go. This is more of your tool making material. They're working with chert here. Again, not a tool. This is what they knocked off of a tool. Or perhaps just part of a broken tool. This is not a tool itself. Interesting, but I suspect this is just a random rock. Strange that it's found here and so sharply broken, I don't see evidence that it was used as a soup stone, whereas these guys, classic soup stones here. Look at this guy. This guy's in the process of breaking right there. Soup stone between a couple of deer tracks. And these are, I'd say, at least a third of these stones around here, at least anything larger than your pinky, are soup stones. With a small number of them being tool making debitage. Here's one that looks like it was discarded before it broke. You see that red crust on it, you see cracks running through it. They probably saw how cracked up it was and said, you know what, this thing's gonna break into 1,000 pieces the next time we toss it into our soup. Let's not have to fish the chunks out. No one wants to crunch on rocks when they're eating a stew. But the vast majority of these were discarded after they broke. We're seeing red crust. None of the rocks around here are naturally red. So where you see red, you are seeing soup stones. Over here, soup stone. You can see inside a little bit, it's actually a black rock, but it's got that red crust. Soup stone. Not a soup stone. Soup stone. Not very red, but you can see those distinctive cracks and the jagged fracture there. There you go. Deep dark red. Inside is, looks like maybe a quartzite. How about this guy here? Looks like maybe a quartzite as well. Let's come over here. How about this guy here? Here's a big guy. Soup stones. How about if I try to use some soup stones, see if it works? But I won't be using artifacts, even if they aren't protected. That's just crazy and dumb and reckless. I'm going to collect a few stones of my own and get a bonfire going. Well, how about we do a little demonstration of how soup stones work. Now, I'm not an archaeologist and I'm not an expert on this, so I'll kind of be learning as I do it. But I believe I've chosen 4 rocks that, based on what I've seen, are representative of the types of rocks they chose for soup stones in our area. That is, I got 2 quartzites here and 2 granites that look a lot like the pieces of fragmented soup stone I find out there, minus the red coloration, which forms after they've been run through the fire a few times. I'm very curious to see if the experiments I do tonight result in these picking up the same red color. We'll find out. Maybe they have to go through 30 or 40 times, maybe 1 time is enough. I just don't know. We'll find out together. I have right here a little sock pot about 1/3 full of water. I didn't want to use pottery, even though that would be more accurate. I just don't trust that these rocks aren't going to explode, and I don't want to break something nice that my wife likes. So I figure this stock pot's pretty well indestructible. So if things go awry, the pot's replaceable, and it could probably survive just about anything that goes on in there. So yeah, let's get started, I suppose. I'm going to be as safe as possible while doing this. Rocks certainly do explode when heated quickly and cooled quickly. There's proof enough just by looking at the shattered soup stones that we already saw from the archaeological site a few miles from here. But I don't know exactly how violently they could explode. I don't know how often they do. If they explode in the water, it's probably not a very big deal. I'm a little bit nervous about them blowing up in the fire, and most dangerously for me, if they blow up while being transported from the fire into the water. So I'm going to do this as safely as possible, and you know, if you're religious, say a prayer for me here. I don't want to lose my face. Ooh, that's not good. There we go. Nope. There we are. Okay. Ah! Now I see this is going to go badly. Native Americans used forked sticks, which you would think probably wouldn't be very effective, but honestly they gotta be working better than these tongs. These tongs are absolute garbage here. Alright, there we go. Alright, I've got them in there. They're close to the coals, and again, I don't really know what I'm doing, so I don't know how long they have to sit in there. I've got a thermal camera with me. You'll see me holding it in a little bit, and once the rocks look hot in the thermal camera, I'll consider them cooked, and I'll move them into the pot of water, and we'll just see how effective these soup stones are at raising the temperature of that pot of water. I suspect it's not going to be that effective. As I understand it, using soup stones was a very labor-intensive process. But I don't need to get this pot up to a boil for demonstration purposes. I think as long as I can raise it 30 or 40 degrees, I'll consider that a success. In case you're wondering what fire looks like in a thermal camera, this is maxing out my thermal sensor. This it looks like it goes up to about a maximum of 180 degrees Celsius. And of course, this fire is significantly hotter than that. It's a bit like pointing a camera at the sun. You can actually see the stones in there are hot, but significantly cooler than the rest of the fire. So I may not be able to really use this thermal camera to decide if the rocks are heated properly or not. I may have to use pure guesswork. I'm also not going to sit close to these rocks as they're heated, because if they do explode, I don't feel like taking burning hot rock fragments to the face. As a former volcanologist, I put myself in danger from that often enough in the past. I don't need that anymore. That chapter of my life is behind me. The temperature of the water, we can take a temperature of the water here. 19 degrees Celsius, 20 degrees Celsius. We'll make a note of that. We'll see how much it heats up when we take those burning rocks out of there. All right, let's make our first attempt at this and see how it goes. As you'll recall, rocks have a high heat capacity, which would indicate it takes a long time for them to heat up. They also have a high heat transfer coefficient. That is, they tend to transfer heat very quickly. So rocks of this size, maybe they're heated all the way through. I'm not entirely sure. This is the part that makes me most nervous here. So let's go ahead and see about transferring a few of those rocks to this bucket of water. That is still it's currently reading about 19 degrees Celsius ish. Alright. That is toasty. here. These guys out. Well, you can see them heating up that water. The water's kind of filthy with the ashes. That's just the risk of doing things this way. But you can see with 4 of these soup stones in here, the temperature of the water is raised about 15 degrees Celsius. So it went from being cold to warm, basically. Certainly not hot enough to cook with yet. Gonna take a lot more soup stones or a lot more repeated cooking here. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and remove one. Still hot. Still very hot. Let's go ahead and just leave that in there for a minute or so. Maybe I'll pull out a different one. You, I think, were one of the first ones I pulled out. Still warm, but not crazy hot. It's that guy right there. And this one we can move right here. And now these are wet, I'm a little bit more worried about them exploding than I was before. I suspect that when Native Americans were using soup stones like these, they were using a lot of them at one time and just rotating them through a lot faster than what I'm doing here. But the water temperature is up to about 35 degrees Celsius now, whereas it was below 20 before. Let's give them a few more minutes in the fire. Alright, well, I'm impatient. Let's go ahead and try this again. To be fair, the rocks went back into the fire quite a bit warmer than they went in last time, so they probably won't need as long to get heated up here. So let's carefully remove this guy and pop him on in. Probably the hottest. Yeah, you were toasty. Look at those plumes of hot water rising up off of those rocks there. Stir this up a little bit here. Something's still crackling in there. Well, that water is still being heated by those rocks. the rocks from the fire. Alright. Let's get this guy first. He was the last one to go in, but whatever. Temperature is around 54 in here. It'll warm up quite a bit in a moment here. Yeah, look at that. This guy might be the hottest one out of all of them. He's really in the middle of the flames, but I cannot get him out. I'm gonna lose all my arm hair doing this. There we are. These guys, oh, these guys are really in the flames over here. This guy right here. Alright. What temperature do we end up with here? I don't know if that microphone is catching it. You can hear it boiling in there. It's boiling down at the bottom. The whole pot overall is boiling. You got a temperature in here of about 65 Celsius or so, which I feel is similar to what it was last time. So, you know, the transfer of heat out of the pot is becoming similar to the transfer of heat via the rocks into the pot at this point. So we're reaching the limitations of our modern technology on simulating the way ancient peoples cooked. But you can see these rocks will certainly warm up that water. And when done properly, with real expertise, with more rocks, you can definitely see exactly how you would get this thing boiling quite a bit faster than I've done here. With probably 3 times as many rocks, you could get this done in, well, 1/3 the time if my arithmetic's any good. And with insulating a piece of pottery instead of this highly conductive metal, because you can see down here the heat just being transferred right out through the base from the sides. A piece of pottery will insulate it a lot better and have a lot less heat loss. It looks like that's almost 70 degrees there, so we're probably close to 70 degrees Celsius. That's hot enough that it'll burn if I stick my hands in. That's a pretty comfortable cup of tea right there. Let's stop filming in infrared and get a little video. This is our moment of truth. How delicious does this look? Our pot of hot water is looking awfully gray at this point. There we are. That's an awfully gray looking mess. Wonder if I can turn a light on here. Yep. That is opaque, dirty, ashy, and I can't imagine it would have been a lot cleaner with Native Americans doing it. Even with a lot of expertise, the rocks you pull out are always going to be ash covered and dirty. So that's just going to be part of what you eat. You see the rocks in there, but yeah, it's by modern day standards of sanitation, we'd call that gross. But you know, there's no bacteria in there, especially if you get this thing boiling. You're just going to be consuming a bit of pot ash with your food. Looking forward to seeing how these rocks look when they're pulled out of here. Let me go ahead. How hot is this? Whew, yep, that's You wouldn't want to bathe in that. That's warm. Probably not warm enough to really cook your food, but warm enough that I don't really feel like sticking my whole hand in there. We'll give this some time to cool off. Maybe we'll have a look at those rocks later tonight. All right, it's been about 20 minutes now. It still looks too hot to stick my hands into. Yeah, well, you know, I could come back in an hour or two or wait until morning, but I'm not a patient man, so let's just dump this out. We'll water the grass with some hot water. I just want to see what these rocks look like. As you can see, the inside of this thing is pretty sandy. There's a lot of rock fragments all mixed in there also. How do the rocks themselves look? Well, besides being pretty hot, well, there we go. We got some cracking going on in that one. That's pretty much the end of that soup stone. How about, ooh, well, my pants are wet now. How about this guy? Oh, this guy is very badly fractured. So you can see these soup stones don't survive hundreds of uses. Really, it's just a few uses, and then they're done. Yep, he's cracking up as well. And of course, that cracking means that in your soup or whatever you're cooking there, you're also going to be getting rock fragments. Not great for your teeth. I'm going to bring these inside, and maybe in the morning when the lighting is good, we'll have a look at the exact coloration they have. All right, my 4 soup stones after cooking. This would be one of the quartzites. You can see it is severely blackened where it was directly against the fire. A lot of cracks running through it. It's definitely about done. It's at the end of its usefulness there. You can see that kind of network of cracks that we saw on some of the soup stones in the forest. Here is a granite. We don't see the red coloration on these that we see in those historic soup stones. These are all black. This one is also cracking in a few places, not quite as dramatically as the quartzite. Here's another granite, again blackened. You can see it's cracking quite a bit there. Definitely think one more trip into the water it would have shattered. And here we got another quartzite. This one also probably would have broken into a half dozen pieces with one more trip into the water. Blackened, but not red. So I can think of 2 possibilities right off the top of my head for why that might be. Number 1, it could be that with exposure to the elements after a few dozen years or a few hundred years even, that the black may wash away and leave red behind. I kind of doubt that's true. My increasing suspicion is that I was doing this wrong and that people probably didn't leave the rocks in the fire as long. They didn't worry about getting it quite as hot and use a lot more stones to speed up the process. So I may have been kind of overcooking these stones in the fire, and I bet that could shorten their lifespan. These only went through the fire 4 or 5 times, but I suspect that when folks knew what they were doing, they could get a lot more use out of these than I did. And perhaps by not heating them quite as dramatically, extending their lifespan, you don't get as much black on there, and perhaps they too turn more of a red. I don't really know. Perhaps an anthropologist could weigh in, someone with better knowledge about this than I. We do use soup stones in the modern world though, and this is how. Here we are back in a sauna. Instead of talking about the air temperature, the metal temperature, the wood temperature, and discussing heat transfer coefficients, let's take a look at the rocks themselves, those traditional rocks that we place there, and why we place them there. The reason we use rocks in a sauna is the same reason ancient peoples used rocks to cook their soups. Those rocks have high heat capacities, high heat transfer coefficients, and you can pour water across them and create a nice steam. It's heaven on earth on a cold Yooper afternoon. And look at the way these rocks transfer heat. They get momentarily cooler as they send up clouds of steam, but they heat right back up very quickly because they are burning hot on the inside and they transfer that heat to their outer surface very quickly. And now, without a proper transition, because I didn't film one, let's go to Gratiot River County Park with a thermal camera. Can we rockhound using a different wavelength of light from what our eyes see? Can we use infrared to find rocks? Well, you can see rocks with the infrared, but do different rock types radiate heat in different ways? Can we use infrared to try to spot agates or basalts or granites? Can we tell them apart? Can we find a desirable rock from the way it radiates heat? As you can see in this video, you can see relatively warm rocks in the cold surf. However, that's not telling you anything about the rock type. Let's take a look at the shore. What are we seeing here? Well, I'm filming this right at dusk, so the rocks are no longer collecting a lot of heat from the sunlight. And what we're seeing here is that the rocks at the top are all kind of universally hot. And if you take a look at the rocks beneath them, they're a bit cooler. It tells you absolutely nothing about rock type. And there appears to be nothing we can learn about the rock type by looking at them through infrared. At least not with this sensitivity of equipment and under these environmental conditions. Here we're seeing exposed rock units. These are sandstones that are jutting out from the beach. The temperature variation you're seeing is based on the contours of the rock. The darker parts receive less sunlight and are consequently a little bit cooler. Here it's about 15 minutes later, and in the absence of sunlight, we see a temperature inversion of the rocks. Whereas before, the hottest rocks were at the surface and the ones beneath were a little bit cooler. Now, the ones at the surface have lost more temperature, and the ones just below are retaining their heat a little bit better because they're insulated by those top layers. However, there is still nothing we can learn by looking at these about the type of rock. And I plan on doing a lot more filming, side-by-side, visual light, and trying to look. But it became immediately obvious that this was just a bust. Honestly, that result is very much expected. I didn't really expect to be able to find a difference, but it would have been a wonderful surprise to learn that just like you can use a UV light to find Yooper lights, if I could go out at dusk with a thermal camera and agates would be popping out at me or unikites would be all over the place. It's just not the case. So unfortunately for the dedicated hobbyist, but perhaps fortunately for your wallet, the thermal camera is not going to be an important new addition to your rockhounding kit.
Well, thank you for joining me on this thermal investigation of rocks. Having a look at what they do when they heat up, how they dissipate their heat and hold on to it, how that was used by ancient peoples for thousands of years in order to cook their foods and render fat. We've learned a lot today, and I hope you've enjoyed the journey with me. Come join me next time. I'll see you out there.